Hello from London, everybody. Well, it's great to be back at the Polyglot gathering. It certainly is one of the highlights of my language learning year. I'm Gareth Popkins from howtogetfluent.com, and my topic today is speak early, speak often, or not. Now, there's no doubt that there's a glamour around speaking a new language early. Of the 4 skills, reading, listening, writing, and speaking's got, it seems to me, the most sparkle. It's social. It offers us the chance to connect with lots of beautiful people directly, like these people here in the picture. It's physical. It feels great to communicate making different sounds. And it certainly sells. You don't see language schools offering to teach you to read. It's all about communication, connection, speaking. Yeah, most of us want to speak. But as independent adult language learners, when in the learning process should we start? So roll up for the battle of the approaches. Should we speak from day one or soon after that? Or maybe we should delay speaking in favor of front-loading input or the receptive skills of listening or reading. Or maybe we should spend time studying our language at the beginning, or a combination of these different approaches. So what are the pros and the cons of speaking early or not? Let's explore through inspiring examples from the online language community in particular. And let's have some practical tips and look for common features among the quite different approaches that successful language learners take. So first of all, let's start with some YouTube Speak Early inspiration. Sadly, this year's gathering is dedicated to the memory of Moses McCormick, or Laoshu 5500, as he was known on YouTube, where he inspired many, many people with the ability to get out there and speak early in his local community in the United States, going into restaurants, into shopping malls with a GoPro camera strapped to his head, striking up conversations, making connections with members of communities, often immigrant communities, who weren't used to an American learning their language and really making connections. What an inspiration for the idea of speaking early. Benny Lewis has also encouraged hundreds of thousands of people to get speaking early with his method of using Skype and video calls to connect with people on his missions, as he would spend 3 months then in a country learning the language. These language learners and others like them speak early and they speak often. But take a closer look. This speaking skill from Moses or Benny doesn't just happen. Early speakers often actually do quite a lot of preparation. They work very hard and they work very smart at the beginning. So if this approach inspires you, here are some tips for early speaking. First, spend a bit of time looking at the pronunciation and the sound system of your new language. For example, concentrate on contrasts or key differences, unfamiliar sounds that aren't in English or aren't in your native language if it's not English. Engage with a phrase book, perhaps. Benny was a big fan of that, using a rough guide phrase book or a Lonely Planet phrase book, something like that as you travel over to familiarize yourself with some useful phrases, or do the first few chapters at least, and maybe the pronunciation section of a beginner course. Anticipate, as Moses McCormick did, frequent questions and answers that you'll typically be asked. What's your name? Where are you from? Why are you learning our language? Is it difficult? How are you learning it? That sort of thing. Moses knew that they would come up again and again. So he spent many, many hours before he launched himself into speaking situations, rehearsing and preparing these basic conversations. You can do the same with the so-called islands of fluency, where you practice particular scripts that are in areas that are relevant to you in your life, about your hobbies, your profession, your family, that sort of thing. And when out there speaking, you can help yourself with gestures, have a pen and paper to hand, use Google Translate. Learn some toolkit phrases to help you keep the conversation going. Could you repeat that, please? What is this or that? How do you say this or that in your language? Please speak more slowly. You can use fillers, like in English we might say, you know what I mean, or all right, to keep the conversation going. Okay, okay. And you can also use questions to check your comprehension and to put the ball back in the court of the person you're talking to win a bit more time for yourself to process what's being said. So let's celebrate, by all means, early speaking. You want to speak, get in there, no detours, you're speaking. You can forge, not forget, real relationships straight away. Many people find it fun, extroverts in particular, to get speaking. But is that your personality? Don't worry, it's not the only way. So let's look at some other approaches. Now, first of all, I want to look at the idea of delaying speaking in favor of comprehensible input, as it's called. This, famously associated with Professor Stephen Krashen, is the idea of acquiring a language, picking up a language from the messages that you understand, rather than deliberately learning it. It's a more natural process, more akin to the way that children learn languages. Listening and reading, input, the receptive skills are the key here. So it doesn't imply early speaking, although it can involve it. Now, for inspiration, I want to look at a case of what I've called live comprehensible input. And in particular, the glowing example of Professor Jeff Brown, a professor of Spanish in a college in California. And Professor Brown learned Arabic at home with exchange partners. During the course of a year in all, he had one-to-one tutors and he attended a lot of meetups. And he continued to do this later in Cairo over a summer, more of the same. And his method was simply to sit down with a fluent speaker and just to try to start to communicate. Listening a lot. And if you haven't seen his video on his YouTube channel, Polyglot a Lot, which is called How to Acquire Any Language, Not Learn It, you can see it there, it's had a couple of million views, then I encourage you to watch it. It's great inspiration for the idea of speaking early using this live comprehensible input method. And he made another video called How to Language Exchange, which is also on his YouTube channel, where he explains in detail how he went about this one-to-one method of using comprehensible input. So his ground rules were no English, or not much, trying to keep 90% in the target language, with no reading, writing, translation, or corrections. Use a pen and paper to draw something if you don't understand. First, he would have a partner translate a handful, but only a handful, of functional words such as yes, no, what is this, into the target language with the help of English, and particularly the phrase, it's not important. If there's something then he wasn't going to understand from context, he would simply move on. It's not important. And he would record his sessions on the phone so that he could listen back to them later. Key tools were magazines, children's story picture books as well. The idea would be that the exchange partner would not read out, but would use the pictures and explain what is happening in each picture, point to things. And then the meaning would be comprehensible with the help of the pictures. The learner can ask who, what, where, some of the simple questions that were prepared in English at the beginning. And Jeff Brown would also have a list of 500 commands in English. And he would ask the partner to mime them, swim, yell, touch the table, and so on. And that way also, the input would be comprehensible. And his goal was to hear every word in a meaningful context 40 times. And so to acquire that word in context, to gradually acquire the language. Now, is this live comprehensible input method for you? Well, it does require access to capable, patient, fluent speakers. But if you watch Professor Brown's videos, you can understand how the process works and maybe train them up to do what you need them to do yourself. But do you have the time to do exchanges, 1 hour in your native language or another language, 1 hour in the target? If you don't have the time, do you have the money to pay teachers to work with you one-to-one? In the current climate, could you do this perhaps online? You get friendships early again with this method. But some might find it a bit labored and frustrating if you really wanted to get out and speak in more realistic situations, Moses or Benny style. Or maybe it's a bit frustrating for you compared with the next method I want to look at. And that's front-loading input from recorded audio or reading. So again, an emphasis on comprehensible input, not on speaking, but not in a live situation. So diving into texts, by which I mean audio recordings or written texts, often without a partner or a teacher, and working out from context. So there's a strong comprehensible input element. The idea input plus one, as it's called, just above your current level, so you've got enough context to be able to understand, to acquire the language. Now, you don't have to look far for inspiration for this approach. In the online language learning community, Steve Kaufman on his YouTube channel is well known for using this approach, reading-based, starting reading from the very beginning. You might know Ikenna Obi's YouTube channel. He has a large following, and he likes to get stuck in as quickly as possible to video that he enjoys, anime, films, TV series, and that sort of thing. Now, if this might appeal to you, here are some tips. Compelling content is the name of the game. You want audio, video, reading, text that are interesting to you. Follow your interests as far as possible. There's a collection in the picture of my texts about language learning, surprise, surprise, although they're not beginners' texts. If you're not normally a reader in your own language, of course, then go for audio or visual, because you're not going to enjoy reading very much in the target language either. You can include some more intensive interaction, so highlighting words or note-taking from audio. It doesn't all have to be extensive where you're not as focused. And of course, you can work with transcripts if you're taking an audio-based approach. If you can't find content that's at the right level, just above your level, consider making the content, the harder materials, comprehensible. You can do this, for example, by pulling apart the first chapter of a book intensively. It might take you a week, 2 weeks to do it. But if you say take a novel, which you've already read in English or another language, so you know what's going on, then you could really work intensively on the first chapter and then be more extensive and see how things develop in the subsequent chapters. If you can find a book that's also an audio book, so you've got the text and the audio, all the better. Read or listen again and again to the same text, or if that's too boring for you, on the same topic to reinforce. Remember, just like Jeff Brown wanted to hear every word 40 times, you're going to need that sort of exposure anyway until it sticks. Don't flog yourself on the back about having a bad memory. It's all about repeat exposure. Now, this front loading of listening and reading does, I think, have some real advantages. You internalize through experience before you speak, which was what question is all about. You can avoid some early speaking risks, like locking in bad pronunciation before you've had enough listening practice, or broken grammar patterns before you've been exposed to sufficient correct language, which of course is something that happens naturally when children learn a first language. They have a long silent period. You can dodge or avoid tedious beginners' conversation topics, which may be boring for you. If you speak early, you're less likely to understand the answers, and learning from context becomes more difficult. You don't yet have the vocabulary, you're not sufficiently familiar with the sound of the language. You're still not convinced that this is not a method for you? Well, here's another one. Another thing you could do is to study first and then get your input and your output later on. So delay all 4 skills, speaking, reading, listening, and writing, in favor of more deliberate learning. So first you can attack the main structures and the high frequency vocab of the language. Now there's lots of inspiration out there for this sort of approach. Take Luca Lampariello, for example, who's well known for using his bidirectional translation method, where he works with a textbook, often from the Assimil series, where you have parallel translations of short dialogues, and he translates them backwards and forwards. It's an activity removed from actual natural speaking or acquisition. It's a more conscious, deliberate study process. Or take David James, who invented the gold list method, which I'm practicing there with my Basque in the picture, where you create lists of individual vocabulary items or phrases, and then you repeat them after an interval using the idea of spaced repetition, discarding the ones that you don't understand until you've distilled down the list to a hard core of words, getting repetition all the time. This is something that Lydia Machova, former organizer of the gathering, uses as well. And Judith Meyer, one of the founders of the gathering, also studies a language hard using a range of textbooks and courses and a whole different mixture of materials. Or take Alexander Arguiz, also on YouTube well known as a very accomplished polyglot, who likes to study the language quite deliberately and intensively. So if you're more the studious type, here are some how-to tips. Approach vocab not just in lists, but in pre-packed chunks of words that often come together. So in English, we happen to say happy birthday, not good birthday. There's no grammatical reason for that. It's just a set chunk. We don't say happy morning for some reason. And learn short set phrases, the sort of phrases like the chunks really, which in a native speaker's brain are processed as one item of information, which is one reason why it's easier for fluent speakers to speak rapidly. They're actually not processing individual words, and it's the same with understanding as well. In terms of grammar, think about patterns. No use learning tables of endings, verb conjugations that you won't be able to apply on the fly. There's no time when you start to speak. So you need to think, can I apply this as I speak? So sentence and phrase patterns, where you can then switch out the subject and the object and so on as you go, are the way to go, rather than trying to memorize grammar rules or tables. Do yourself a favor and get a self-study course with audio, absolutely essential. Could be Assimil, Teach Yourself, something like that, or online, something like Glossica with audio. Combining text and audio, it gives you a set of milestones. You don't need to reinvent the wheel here. Lots of people have been on your journey with the language. So why don't you let an experienced guide lead you through? It's more important to stick with it and to work through than always to be searching for the perfect course, I think. And of course, you don't have to finish it all. You can dip in and out of it. Make your work with your course materials as interactive as you can. So you can use techniques such as retelling the short dialogues from your book. Maybe working one-to-one with a teacher to do that. Or just retelling into the recording function on your phone. You can use flashcards. Some people like them, some people don't. But there's a test and a recall element there to strengthen and consolidate your active command of vocabulary of phrases, chunks. Some people love self-correct exercises. I'm definitely in that camp. Again, not everybody is. But it's a way of being interactive, forcing recall, flagging up things you haven't yet absorbed. Or the two-way translation method that I've already mentioned. In praise of study, that's actually me there in the picture in Fukuoka at the time of the Polyglot conference 18 months ago. You might not recognize me because I've got a different pair of glasses on today. Now, in praise of study then, it can feel more structured and systematic. If you're a control freak, you like order, you like a methodical approach, working with a textbook might just be the way to go. After all, you're an adult. Do you really need to have to work out by people pointing basic ideas? Can't it be quicker to be told than to discover? Or at least it may feel that way to you. And in a sense, what's important is not the science, but how you're going to enjoy engaging with the learning process, because all of these methods do produce fluent speakers in the end. You can then, having got the basic vocabulary, a vocabulary of 2,000 words or more, and all the key patterns, sentence patterns of the language, hit the ground running with listening, reading, and speaking later on. Get straight into more interesting conversations and more compelling materials. Now, it's true that if you've been studying the language, you may sound more stilted at first. You sound like a textbook. So what? So what? I'm learning the language anyway. If this might be the approach for you, don't be put off. The more real practice you then get, the more natural you'll sound anyway later on. And we're all going to sound a bit unnatural in the early stages and perhaps all the way through our language learning lives. Does it really matter? Unless you want to work as a spy? Now, if you are thinking of delaying speaking, there are some traps to avoid. So if you're thinking of going for the comprehensible input approach first, or for studying the language first, be aware of these 3 traps. First, what I've called the displacement activity trap. Now, this is all about feel-good procrastination. Whether you're using, for example, an app which is gamified to get you addicted to it, but might not be particularly effective, maybe better used as a bit of extra downtime exposure. Just buying more language learning books and language learning materials, a lot of us have been there. Learning about the language. Yeah, some of us like to get an idea of the map, stand and survey the country before we start. Fine, read a grammar book, a short grammar summary in that spirit. But don't think you're going to learn to speak the language by reading about the language. And getting incomprehensible input. If you're actually reading and you don't understand anything at all or hardly anything, or listening to native level audio and expecting it somehow to seep in, it ain't going to happen. So avoid incomprehensible input. It's a form of displacement activity, which isn't to say that in your downtime, you might not have native level radio on when you're in the shower or something. I like to do that at the beginning, even though I don't understand anything, because I enjoy feeling connected to the language, starting to get the rhythms and the sounds of it, but it's not enough on its own. Next, the perfectionism trap. Now, there's nothing wrong with a me, Tarzan, you, Jane type telegraphic speech at the beginning. Don't be a perfectionist. You've got to go through that stage. And expect misunderstandings, frustration, and mistakes. Expect to forget many, many times over. It's part of the process. And so many people tell themselves early on, oh, I don't have the language gene, I don't have the memory for it. When actually, yeah, some people are better than others. They do have better memories. They latch on to the sounds better. But your average person or your below average person, they do effective things and they stick at it, they can get fluent. And finally, what I'd call the perfectionism trap. Oh, loosen up. Yeah, I wanted to say that. Loosen up. If you're a bit of a perfectionist, actually, this is the best thing to remember. Nobody cares about your abilities in the language. They want to connect with you, or you need to get a message across. Could I have 3 loaves of bread, please, or something? It's not a language exam. So loosen up. Nobody minds if you make mistakes. They want to connect with you, and you want to understand them and be understood by them. And the expat trap, finally. So this is when you're living abroad for a longer period, perhaps with work, or perhaps with a partner who's been transferred abroad for work. Now, it's harder to change languages or social groups later. So for you, I really would encourage to get yourself as early as possible into an environment where you need to speak the language. Otherwise, whoosh, 20 years will have gone by and you still can't speak any of the language, and you're expecting people to speak usually English to you in the shops and so on. And you're missing so much. We've all seen examples of that. So know what's out there, experiment, and blend your approach. As we've seen, the different approaches each have their advantages and their drawbacks. They can all work, but will they work for you? Sure, it's inspiring to be out there in the mile, speaking to people, making new connections straight away, but is it you? It can be really intriguing to start reading and listening a lot straight away and working things out from context. But is it too isolating for you? Is it just too frustrating for your personality? Do you have the patience for study? Do you prefer that? You feel more in control? You can mark out your progress? Or do you find textbooks restricting, unrealistic, exercises totally boring? These methods can all work, but will they work for you? Whichever approach you take, though, remember the common factors for learning success. So getting lots of deliberate interaction, whether it's with audio or written texts, course materials of various types, or conversations. You're going to need hundreds and hundreds of hours of practice. Accepting that and knowing that it's a frustrating long road, but also a wonderfully exciting one, is the key thing, I think. And expecting things to develop too quickly without you having had sufficient practice across all the skills is, I think, the main reason, rather than the method, why inexperienced language learners end up giving up. So blend to suit really what works for your personality and, of course, for your circumstances. We're all in a different position. We all like to engage in different ways with materials. Experiment with all these approaches and let your approach evolve. So first, experiment, choose something that you think is going to work for you, but that doesn't mean you have to stick with that method forever. No, your approach will evolve as you become a more experienced language learner, but also as you move through the levels in a given language. What you need to do when you're an advanced speaker isn't going to be the same, or an intermediate speaker, obviously, as when you're a beginner. And that's just what the pros do. They mix and match, and they let it evolve. So know what's out there, experiment, and blend. But don't forget to speak, particularly those of you who are going to go for a comprehensible input or for a study method. You see, we don't have to speak from day one if we don't want to, no. Yet, if we want to become fluent speakers, we do actually, at some stage sort of have to speak. Introverts, shy, studious types, we probably need to speak before we feel ready. And all language learners, whatever your personality, whatever the method and the approach that you prefer, remember, we need to speak a lot. Okay, thank you very much. Now we've got some questions, I think. Do you have any tips how to work on our speaking if we already started speaking and our understanding or comprehension is already good, especially for shy speakers? Well, I think already having a good comprehension and good understanding is really the most difficult thing in many ways, and all that you need after that with speaking is practice. Quite a few learners who go for the comprehensible input approach, say that speaking will develop naturally once you start doing it if you're familiar enough with the language. What Krashen said, I had the quote there. But if you're shy, then you can, work online perhaps. So one-to-one language exchanges online, you could turn off the camera if you're shy. But also do tell yourself that nobody's that worried about how good you are. They want to connect with you, and try and focus on the other person. Be interested in them. Take some of the pressure off yourself. It's easy to say all this, it's harder to do it. But try and work out whether the shyness is a wider issue with you, or whether it's just to do with using the language, getting used to it, and maybe you need to push through it. Or maybe it's because you're not really quite as ready yet. But do get speaking as early as you can then at this stage when you've already got a good basis. What's your opinion on self-talk? Well, I do sometimes walk around the house talking to myself, according to my housemates. A lot of language learners find it very useful. I don't use it much as a language learning tool, but it is a very useful method for a lot of people. So I'm certainly in favor of it, I'd say. If we taught a group of students, what would be your recommendation to combine these two types of learning? Because of students' different preferences. This is a hard one when you're managing a group. One thing I didn't mention, when you're doing study as well, is don't overplay the role of the teacher. So as adult self-learners, independent learners, we need the teacher to give us feedback, motivation, someone to connect to. Similarly, group classes, we go to them to learn some more, to learn from other speakers, to have contact with the teacher, for the social element. But we should be taking responsibility as much as possible for our own language and getting over the idea that it's the job of the teacher to somehow decant the language, to pour the language into our head, which we maybe have if the last time we learned a language was at school. But if you are a teacher, as in the question, teaching a class, it is very difficult, I admit, to combine and to please everybody. So I think you have to go for a mixture of approaches, maybe explaining to students exactly what you're doing and why, and say that there's something for everybody during the course of a class or a series of classes. Totally agree with you, but do you agree with the idea of propodic, the propodic language, value of languages? That's my new word for the day. So the idea that it's better to start learning an easier language first. No, I don't agree with that. I think, this is the idea of Esperanto is often used as an example. So yeah, it can give you confidence to learn the new language, but what's important is whether you need the language, whether it means something to you, whether you can connect with it. Of course, some languages are harder than others, and it depends a lot on what your native language is, whether you've learned a closely related language. But I would tackle the language you want to learn rather than going somewhere else, going to B because you want to get to A. What do you recommend for multiple languages? Studying multiple languages. I'd like to start learning more languages, but I feel that one language might hinder the progress of others. Well, generally, I think the sort of standard advice on this is it's better to, well, actually, there's conflicting advice. If you learn two closely related languages, you can contrast them, but there's the risk you might mix them up. So learning Spanish and Italian, for example, together. You could take a contrastive approach. If you're doing two completely different languages, then you're less likely to mix them up. So that's something to think about. I would concentrate on one first, and then when you get to an intermediate level, maybe start with the next one. But there is the argument as well, learn as many as possible if you're a language lover, and you just you're training up more and more of the facility of learning languages. But I think the key issue boils down to time and motivation. If you're going to learn two languages, you're going to halve the speed of progress, even if everything else works fine, that you would otherwise have had. So it's up to you to decide. And of course, you can always leave one language at the side when your curiosity has been satisfied a bit, and then focus in on one. What's your way to find out the most common structures and vocabulary to attack when first learning another language? Well, I get a comprehensive course, a textbook, or an online course normally, because then I know that all the key important structures that I need and some key basic vocabulary is going to be set out. Most of us need the same high frequency words. Then we need to talk about a profession or something that's more unique to us, bespoke to us as well. But I do like a textbook to give me an overview, to give me structure, and to explain things I'm struggling with. And only then, if I'm still stuck, would I want to ask a teacher. And I do get a bit frustrated. So one of my languages is Welsh, and there's a Facebook group for Welsh learners. And you see beginners time and again, week after week in the feed, asking the same basic questions, people piling in on Facebook. Sometimes our answers are right, sometimes they're not. And I think, learner, why don't you just have a reference source where you could get a clear, authoritative answer to this question, rather than this sort of blind leading the blind situation? So I think a textbook is great. Other people prefer to work with flashcard decks or some sort of sentence repetition system, which is automated, things you can find on Memrise or Glossica, that sort of thing. But I'm a course fan, whether it's a textbook or an online interface course. Correcting pronunciation later on is much, much harder once the basics are established, I think. You know, if you are able to get good enough in the language, for many of us, that's sufficient. You don't want it to be a strain for people to listen to you. And you can get very, very fluent and still have quite a strong accent, as long as key parts of the accent are sorted out. But if you don't lock in certain things early on, I think it can be difficult later on. So I'm learning Japanese at the moment, and I'm struggling with this concept of pitch accent. I'm sure I'm not getting it right. And I am a bit worried that it's something, am I going to be able to correct that later on when I can't really properly hear it yet? So there is an argument for training up pronunciation as much as you can early. But again, it depends. Does it matter to you? Is it something you're interested in? But it can be really rewarding to do. But again, start early. What's your current belief? That's a good question. Well, it may have sort of come out in what I've said, but I do like to start with a textbook study, but then I mix it up. So that's the approach I've been taking with Japanese. But then about 6 months in, I did start to have 1 or 2 lessons on italki, one-to-one, because I just couldn't say very much, but I wanted to feel, hey, this works. I can do some basic communication. And then I've stopped doing that again now. When I was learning Basque, started several years before that, I was doing a lot of one-to-one conversations early on, but I just found myself repeating the same basic conversations again and again. And that it's very nice to meet different teachers and so on, but I just didn't feel that was as efficient as the approach that I've generally gone for, which is taking a textbook with audio, gutting it, flashcarding the content. That is my approach. I know it's not for everybody, but listening a lot really from the start as well, even if I don't understand, and as soon as possible. So now I'm listening to a lot of Japanese beginners podcasts, for example. I tend to prefer audio only to audio and video because there's a higher word count. But I understand, of course, it's easier to learn from context if you're watching video. For me, I tell myself I need to speak in order to test my learning. But what are the alternatives that I'm not aware of? Okay, well, if you're wanting to test your learning, if that's the question, you can start reading, you can practice the other skills, you can practice writing and getting feedback on your writing, for example. If you're wanting to test your learning in the sense of, do I have the active vocabulary? Do I have the active grammar? So I'm not quite sure what the angle is there coming from that question. But of course, and if you're going to take language tests, I know this wasn't the question, but generally find out whether they have a speaking element. They don't all. So the common Japanese ones don't have a speaking element, I think. But Normally, you've got to progress across all 4 skills. And certainly as you get to the higher levels, you want to do well, that's going to be the case. Most adult speakers you're conversing with will be people who are educated, who do a lot of reading as well. In a modern society, it's not really necessarily an orally based society. So you need to develop the same sort of fluidity and capacity with the language at the higher levels as a native. And that's going to involve reading and writing a lot too. Do you suggest to start from one particular skill, reinforce it, and step by step covering the others? I think it's not all or nothing. I think that's something maybe came out from my talk, that some of the people I mentioned who prefer the different methods are doing other things as well. It's what you foreground. So I don't think you necessarily just need to focus on one. So I used this phrase front loading, meaning giving more emphasis, spending more time learning in a particular way early on. Of course, nature would suggest that we should start with listening and listening a lot. And I do think a lot of listening is really important from the start. But it doesn't mean some of us as adults want to start writing straight away. We're already educated adults. Similarly, we want to start connecting much quicker because we don't have to wait like children for our muscles in our mouth to develop. We might have to retrain them and so on before we can actually speak. So I suppose listening is the natural skill to start with, but I think whatever keeps you engaged is the key. Does it feel reasonable for you to have different learning approaches depending on your target language? Yes, it might do. So speaking, for example, of my Japanese experience now, I started off thinking, I'm going to learn the kanji, so the Chinese characters. I want to do the whole thing. I was looking down at courses which had transliteration, the Romanji system. I was going to do both in parallel, learn to write and to read and learn to listen and to speak. I don't have enough time. I only want to spend half an hour a day on the language. Now I've decided with that language, with a very different script, I'm going to just listen and then practice speaking the language. And as someone says actually in Jeff Brown's video, once you've got an active vocabulary of 5,000 words, it's pretty easy to learn to read the language. Obviously, it's always a big task to learn Japanese, Chinese characters. If the alphabet is basically a similar system like Greek or Russian to the English, then I would start with that straight away. And someone mentions there Georgian. So that the same would apply to Georgian, actually, I think. But at one stage, I had learned the Georgian script. I spent some time at the end of the Soviet Union, and there a lot of the wine came from Georgia. And the wine bottles were often bilingual Cyrillic and Georgian scripts. And at one time, I knew the Georgian script well enough to be able to check and control against the Cyrillic whether I'd got the type of wine correct. But it's a beautiful script. I'd have to start again. But it's basically the same system as the Latin alphabet. So definitely start with the script straight away. But of course, with Georgian, the sound system is absolutely vital, all those consonants. And don't get confused, the relationship between sounds and the script in English is very, very irregular. You do need to focus on the sounds and not be distracted or confused by the script. Even if you're learning a language in the Latin alphabet, of course, the value given to each symbol can be very different. Well, that's it. I think we're out of time. Thanks very much for all your questions. I'm going off now to get a coffee, and then I'm looking forward to some more talks here at the gathering. Thanks very much for being with me. Bye.